In this lecture, we're going to see that it is possible to set up multiple or a multitude of handlers for a single exception in your C++ program. Consider what we did in the last lecture where we only had one point where we set up a catch handler to catch our exception. It is possible to really do the reverse of what we did in the last lecture and set up as many try and catch blocks as we can in our C++ program. For example, we can go in F1 and put in a try block before we call F2, and we can do something like we are doing here. In F2, we can really do the same and put a try block before we call F3 like we are doing here. And if we catch the exception, we're going to say that it is handled in F2 and our function is going to end properly. We can do the same thing in F3 and wrap our call to exception thrower in a try block. And if an exception happens to be thrown, it is going to be handled in here. It is possible to do something like this. We can even go as far as putting another try block in the main function, and this is going to catch our exception if we hit this point without this exception being handled by any other downstream functions. So this is something you can do, and you can set up as many try and catch blocks as you can in your C++ program. And if you happen to do this, the only function that is not going to end properly is the exception thrower function, which is really the point where the problem is located in our C++ program. So let's head over to Visual Studio Code and see how this really works out in practice. Here we are in our working folder. The current project is multiple handlers for exceptions. We are going to grab our template files like we always do, and we're going to put this in our project. And we are going to open this in Visual Studio Code pretty quick. This is going to give us our main CPP file that we can clean up and remove whatever it is we don't need here. We are going to put in our function declarations like we did in the last lecture. So let's put them in place. We are going to hop over below the main function and put in our definitions. And this should be not strange to you by now because we have done all this in the last lecture. But the new thing we are doing here is that each function is wrapping the function call in a try block, which is going to be handling the exception if any is thrown. This is what we are doing here. So we have a try block in F1, we have a try block in F2, we have a try block in F3, and if the exception is thrown in our exception thrower function, it is going to be handled as soon as possible. And in this case, it is going to be handled in F3 because it is the closest point to the point where we have thrown this exception here. This is the logic. So we are really going to go super crazy with our try catch blocks, and we are going to even put another one in the main function as you see here and wrap our call to F1 in a try block. So what is going to happen here? Try to guess the flow of our program here. Give it a try, and I am going to give you my take on this. We are going to hit the main function and we are going to try and run F1. This is going to bring execution to the point of F1 here. So we are going to start F1 and try to run F2. This is going to bring execution in F2. We are going to start running F2. We are going to see the message here. And after this, we are going to try and run F3. So code execution is going to go in F3 and we are going to start F3 here. And we are going to start our exception thrower function. We can right click and go to definition to see what is happening in this function. And we are going to see that this is going to start execution thrower. That's what we are going to say here. We should really say exception thrower. So let's correct this. Exception thrower, and we are going to say the same thing below here. And it is going to throw an exception here. Once we throw this exception, this function is going to freeze because it is not handled here. So the exception is going to be propagated to the englobing scope. And that's going to be whoever called this function. So we are going to fall in F3 here, and we are going to be lucky to find a catch block, which is going to handle it. We are going to say exception handled in F3, and we are going to end F3. We are going to end F2 properly. We are going to end F1 properly, and we are going to go back in main and end the main function properly and say main is finishing up here. Let's make sure we run this program and use the GCC as our favorite compiler. You can really use any compiler you want. Any is going to do fine. The build is good. As you see here, we are going to bring up a PowerShell window and we are going to run Rooster. And we are going to see that all the functions are going to start. And the only one which is not going to end properly is exception throw, where you see that we don't hit the end of it. But the exception is going to be handled in F3 and all the other functions are going to end properly. So what does this tell us? It is possible to go crazy with try and catch blocks and really go crazy with exceptions, but hopefully this shows you the point that some people make in saying that using exceptions is going to make your code harder to read and follow. You can see that we have a lot of noise in terms of try and catch blocks, so I wouldn't really recommend going this far in using exceptions in your C++ program. What I usually do is make sure I know which functions throw exceptions in my C++ program. For example, if I know that exception thrower happens to throw an exception, I am going to wrap its call in a try and catch block, and I am going to make sure I handle that exception, and all the other functions are going to be clean and clear of these try and catch blocks. This is something you can do, but I am going to leave this choice to you because you are the expert when it comes to the project you are building with C++. My job here is to make you aware of the possibilities. This is really all I had to share in this lecture, showing you that it is possible to set up multiple handlers at different levels for the same exception. We are going to stop here in this lecture. In the next one, we're going to see that it is possible to nest try blocks. Go ahead and finish up here and meet me there.